"Hi, I'm David, and I saw Sergeant Reyes, a man who'd faced down death more times than I could count, laugh in the face of an 11-year-old boy while our patrol's only jeep sat dead in the middle of an ambush. He had no idea our lives were hanging by a thread that only that boy knew how to fix. It's strange what a uniform and a bit of authority can blind you to. Have you ever felt completely invisible, even when you knew you held the key to everything? Before I tell you how that kid, Leo, used nothing but a worn-out pocket knife to bring that engine roaring back to life, comment where you're watching from and subscribe to the channel. Believe me, you're not going to want to miss the look on the sergeant's face when he finally turned that key. We were caught, plain and simple, pinned down in a dusty, narrow mountain pass that felt more like a grave than a road. Snipers owned the high ground, and every gust of wind sounded like it could be the whistle of an incoming round. The air was thick with tension, the kind that makes your teeth ache and your palms sweat. Our only way out, our only hope of breaking through the kill zone, was the Willis Jeep, and it was dead. Not sputtering, not struggling, just silent. A heavy, metallic corpse in the middle of the road. Sergeant Reyes had kicked the tires, cursed at the engine, and then declared it useless. Morale, which was already low, evaporated into the hot, dusty air. We were sitting ducks, just waiting for the inevitable. And then there was Leo. He was a war orphan we'd picked up a few weeks back, a quiet, observant kid who barely said 2 words. To most of the patrol, especially Corporal Miller, he was just another mouth to feed, a liability, a piece of bad luck we were dragging along with us. Miller made no secret of his feelings, muttering under his breath about the boy being a jinx. But I'd seen Leo watching things. He wasn't like other kids. He didn't fidget or complain. He just watched, his eyes taking in every detail, especially when someone was working on equipment. He'd spend hours watching the mechanics back at base, his expression unreadable. In that pass, while the rest of us were staring at the ridges, Leo was staring at the dead Jeep. Sergeant Reyes and one of our guys, a private who claimed he knew a thing or two about engines, had spent the better part of an hour with the hood up. They did everything by the book, everything the military manual told them to do. They checked the battery, terminals making sure they were clean and tight. They checked the fuel line for a clog, getting gasoline all over their hands for nothing. They even pulled the distributor cap, looking for a crack or moisture. Each attempt was met with the same deadening silence when Reyes turned the key. It was a methodical, desperate, and completely fruitless effort. With every failed attempt, the canyon walls seemed to close in a little more, the silence from the enemy snipers feeling less like a reprieve, and more like they were just enjoying the show. Finally, Reyes slammed the hood shut with a grunt of pure frustration that echoed in the pass. "It's scrap," he announced to all of us, his voice flat with defeat. "The ignition's shot to hell. We're on foot." The words hung in the air, a death sentence for at least some of us. Moving through that open terrain without the speed and cover of the Jeep was suicide. You could see the hope drain from the men's faces, replaced by a grim, hollowed-out acceptance. Miller just spat on the ground and glared at the Jeep, then at Leo as if it were all the boy's fault. We were no longer a reconnaissance patrol. We were just a line of men about to walk into a meat grinder, and the silence that followed the sergeant's order was the scariest sound I had ever heard. As Reyes started barking out orders, telling us to pack light and be ready to move in 5, a small tug on his sleeve made him stop. It was Leo. The boy didn't say a word. He never did. He just looked up at the sergeant, his face smudged with dirt, and pointed a small greasy finger toward the engine bay. Reyes, annoyed, just shook his head. "Get out of the way, kid. This is no time for games." But Leo didn't move. He just stood there, pointing with a quiet, unshakable insistence. There was something in his eyes, not fear, but a focused certainty that was completely out of place in that moment of absolute despair. For a second, everyone just froze, watching this silent standoff. Between a hardened veteran and a skinny orphan, Corporal Miller let out a short, cynical laugh that cut through the tense air. "For God's sake, Sergeant, are we really doing this? We're wasting time. The kid's probably pointing at a shiny bolt." His words were like poison, validating the fear and impatience that was already gripping the other men. Reyes looked torn, his face a mask of frustration. He glanced up at the ridges where the enemy was hiding, then back down at the small, determined face of the boy. He clearly wanted to dismiss him, to push him aside and get on with the suicide march he'd just ordered. But Leo's stare was unwavering. It wasn't a plea. It was a statement. He knew something. The rest of us just shifted our weight, the straps of our packs digging into our shoulders, caught in this bizarre silent power struggle. Leo didn't flinch at Miller's mockery. He just took a small step closer, his eyes locked on Sergeant Reyes, and pointed again. This time, he tapped, his finger against the greasy metal of the engine block, with a quiet insistence that was more powerful than any shout. It was the calmest thing in that whole chaotic canyon. The silence stretched, broken only by the wind whistling through the rocks. It was a sound that made the hairs on your neck stand up. I could see the conflict in the sergeant's eyes. His training, his experience, everything was telling him this was a fool's errand, but we were already in a hopeless situation. What was one more minute? What was one more foolish hope when all the sensible ones had already died with the Jeep's engine? Finally, with a sigh that carried the weight of our entire doomed patrol, Reyes relented. "All right," he said, his voice flat and devoid of any real hope. "Fine, you've got 60 seconds, kid, show me." He made it sound like an execution order, not an opportunity. He turned to Miller. "Time him. 60 seconds, not one more." The cruelty of it was breathtaking. It wasn't a chance. It was a setup. It was a way to publicly prove the boy was a fool so they could get on with the business of dying. Miller pulled out his watch with a smug grin, his face saying what he was thinking. "Let's get this little circus over with." The other men watched, their expressions a mix of pity and morbid curiosity. They were about to watch a child's hope get crushed under the heel of a stopwatch. Leo didn't seem to hear the sergeant's tone or see Miller's sneer. The moment he got the nod, he was in motion. He scrambled onto the Jeep's front bumper, his skinny legs finding purchase on the steel. He didn't lunge for the big, obvious parts like the distributor cap or the battery. Instead, he leaned deep into the engine bay, his head disappearing among the hoses and belts. His movements were not frantic or childish. They were deliberate, economical. He ran his small, dirt-caked fingers lightly over a thick bundle of wires that ran along the firewall, a spot that was grimy and tucked away, completely ignored by the men who had been fumbling around earlier. He wasn't just looking, he was feeling, his brow furrowed in a concentration so intense it seemed to suck all the sound out of the air around him. Then he did something that made Miller snort in derision. He reached into the pocket of his tattered trousers and pulled out a small, old-fashioned pocket knife. The wooden handle was worn smooth from use, and the blade, when he flicked it open, was small and unassuming. "Oh, this is Rich," Miller muttered to another soldier loud enough for all of us to hear. "He's going to perform surgery with a toy." A few of the guys chuckled nervously, the sound hollow and wrong. The sight was just so absurd. This massive, complex piece of military machinery, which had defeated trained men, was now facing a child armed with nothing more than a pocket knife. It felt like the final, pathetic punchline to a very bad joke. Our lives depended on this, and our last hope was a kid with a whittling knife. But I'd seen that knife before. A week earlier, back at the forward operating base, our shortwave radio had gone dead. The comms tech had given up on it, saying the internals were fried. I saw Leo pick it up later when no one was looking. He sat with it for an hour, that same knife in his hand, not cutting, but carefully prying open the casing and gently nudging tiny components back into place with the tip of the blade. He didn't say a word, and when he was done, he just left it on the bench. Later that night, I saw the comms tech staring at it in disbelief because a faint crackling voice was coming through the speaker. I had dismissed it as a fluke, a coincidence. Now, watching him lean over that engine, I felt a cold knot of shame in my stomach for ever doubting him. Leo ignored the whispers and the ticking clock. He used the tip of the knife to scrape away a thick cake of dried mud and grease from a small metal clamp holding the wiring harness to the engine block. It was a spot no one would ever think to look, buried deep and out of sight. He worked with the focus of a bomb disposal expert, each movement precise and necessary. Then he did something even stranger. He pressed his ear against the bundle of wires he had just cleaned, closing his eyes. He was listening to a dead engine. Just as Miller opened his mouth to call time, a single, sharp crack of a sniper rifle echoed down the pass, closer this time. Everyone flinched, but Leo didn't even move. Reyes, who had been about to turn away, froze. He held up a hand, silencing Miller without a word. For the first time, I saw a flicker of something other than despair on his face. It was a sliver of impossible, terrifying hope. His hand stayed up, a silent command that cut through the rising panic. The sniper shot had changed the equation. This wasn't a game anymore. It was a live-fire test of the sergeant's judgment. Every man in that pass was holding his breath, their eyes darting. Between the ridgeline and the strange scene unfolding at the front of the jeep, I saw Miller's jaw tighten, his hand hovering over his rifle, ready to move. But Reyes's focus was absolute. He wasn't looking at the enemy. He was looking at Leo, and for the first time it wasn't with pity or frustration. It was with a raw, desperate curiosity. The wind howled again, a low moan that sounded like a warning, but the only thing that mattered in that moment was the quiet, greasy space under the hood of that dead jeep. Leo pulled his head out of the engine bay, his expression completely neutral. He wasn't scared by the gunshot. He wasn't excited by the attention. He was just working. He wiped a greasy hand on his trousers and then pointed, with that same small, determined finger, at the spot he had just scraped clean with his knife. It was a single, unremarkable clamp holding a thick black wire against the chassis. He looked at Reyes, his dark eyes conveying a message with more clarity than any words could. He tapped the wire, then the metal clamp, then the wire again. He was showing a connection, a point of contact that wasn't supposed to be there. It was a silent, desperate lecture on basic electronics, delivered in a kill zone by a child who probably couldn't even spell electricity. Reyes, his face a mask of grim concentration, leaned over the fender, getting his uniform jacket dirty. He squinted, trying to see what the boy was seeing. At first, it was just a jumble of parts, the same mess he and the other soldier had stared at for an hour. But he was looking with different eyes now. He wasn't looking for a broken part. He was looking for a wrong connection. He followed the boy's finger and saw it, a tiny, almost invisible shimmer on the wire's black insulation, right where it was pressed tightest by the clamp. It was a faint abrasion, a spot worn down by thousands of miles of vibration, exposing the barest hint of copper beneath. It was nothing. It was everything. A problem so small and so simple that their by-the-book training had made them completely blind to it. Leo seemed to sense the sergeant's understanding. He took his pocket knife again, but this time he didn't use the blade. He used the closed, smooth handle to tap gently on the wire. Tap, tap, tap. Then he moved the handle and tapped the metal of the engine block. Tap, tap, tap. He was illustrating the flow of power, showing how the electricity was leaking, grounding out before it could ever reach the ignition. It was a brilliant, simple demonstration that cut through all the military jargon and technical manuals. He was speaking the universal language of mechanics, a language of cause and effect. Miller just watched, his mouth slightly open, the cynical smirk finally gone from his face, replaced by a look of pure, dumbfounded confusion. He was witnessing something that his entire world-view couldn't process. Suddenly, a second shot cracked through the air, and this one was terrifyingly close. Dirt and gravel kicked up from the ground not 5 feet from the jeep's front wheel, the impact a sharp thwack that made us all jump. "Sergeant, we've got to go!" a private named Harris yelled from behind me, his voice cracking with fear. "They've got us zeroed in. We have to move." The spell was broken. The quiet focus around the engine evaporated, replaced by the cold, immediate reality of our situation. The men started shifting nervously, their training screaming at them. To find cover, to run, to do anything but stand here in the open, waiting for a child to finish his science experiment. All eyes were on Reyes, waiting for the order that would either save us or send us to our deaths. Sergeant Reyes didn't even flinch. He didn't look at Harris or acknowledge the new wave of fear rippling through the patrol. He straightened up slowly, his eyes never leaving Leo's. He had seen enough. The choice had been made, not in a moment of panic, but in a moment of quiet revelation. He looked directly at the boy, his voice low and steady, cutting through the tension. "Tell me what to do," he said. It wasn't a question. It was a surrender, a full transfer of command over this one, critical task. He was no longer the sergeant in charge. He was the assistant to an 11-year-old mechanic. The silence that followed his words was more profound than the one after the engine died. Miller looked like he'd been struck by lightning. The fate of the entire patrol now rested on the next move of a child with a pocket knife. Leo didn't hesitate. He seemed to have been waiting for that exact moment of trust. He leaned back into the engine, the sergeant right beside him, shielding him with his own body. With a surgeon's steadiness, Leo inserted the tip of his knife into the tiny space between the wire and the clamp. He didn't cut. He just pried. He carefully, painstakingly, bent the metal clamp back just a few millimeters, creating a small but definite air gap between the worn wire and the metal frame. He was isolating the short. Then he gently pushed the wire itself into the new space, ensuring it was no longer touching anything it shouldn't be. The whole operation took less than 20 seconds. When he was done, he pulled back, wiped the knife on his shirt, and looked up at Reyes. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. The fix was in. Reyes didn't need words. He saw the nod, and something in his posture shifted. The weight of command, the fear, the frustration. It all seemed to coalesce into a single point of action. He moved with a purpose I hadn't seen since the ambush started, not toward cover, but straight to the driver's side door of the Jeep. He didn't look back at us, didn't check the ridges for snipers. His entire world had shrunk to that ignition switch. The rest of us were frozen in place, a tableau of disbelief. We were watching a man who had just minutes ago declared our only escape route a heap of scrap metal, now about to bet. All our lives on the silent nod of a child. Miller stood there, his mouth hanging slightly open, his stopwatch forgotten in his hand. The only sound was the wind and the frantic beating of my own heart against my ribs. He slid into the driver's seat, the worn leather groaning under his weight. He didn't slam the door, he just pulled it shut with a quiet click that seemed deafening in the tense silence. His hands, which had been clenched in frustration earlier, were now steady as he reached for the key still dangling in the ignition. I saw him take a deep breath, his eyes fixed forward through the dusty windshield. It was the kind of moment that stretches time, where a single second feels like a lifetime. Every soldier in that pass, every one of us who had accepted our fate, was now locked onto that simple mechanical action, turning a key, an act we'd all done 1,000 times without a thought, but this time it held the power of a prayer, a verdict, and a last-ditch miracle all rolled into one. The sniper hadn't fired again, as if even the enemy was holding its breath to see what would happen next. Reyes turned the key. There wasn't the dead click of before. Instead, a choked, guttural cough erupted from the engine. It was a single, violent sputter, a gasp for life that was immediately followed by silence. The sound was both hopeful and heartbreaking. It was a sign of life, but a weak one, like a man drowning who breaks the surface for a single breath before sinking. Again, a collective groan of disappointment went through the patrol. "It's nothing," Miller muttered, his voice a mix of relief and renewed cynicism. "Just a fluke. We're wasting time." He was right back to being the voice of doom, and you could feel the fragile hope that had briefly flickered among the men die out completely. Reyes slumped forward slightly over the steering wheel, the brief flicker of hope on his own face extinguished. It seemed the miracle had been a false alarm, but Leo didn't look disappointed. He didn't even look surprised. He just leaned forward, peering past the sergeant's shoulder at the dashboard. He held up his hand, his small fingers forming a V, then he pointed insistently at the gas pedal near the floor. He didn't say a word, but the instruction was perfectly clear. He was telling Reyes to pump the gas. It was something an old-timer would know, a trick for a flooded or hesitant carburetor, not something you'd find in a modern military field manual. It was another piece of that forgotten, practical knowledge he'd absorbed in his father's garage. Reyes looked from the boy's hand to his eyes, and I saw the decision being made. He had come this far. He wasn't going to stop trusting the boy now, not when they were so close. He gave Leo a short, sharp nod. With his left hand still on the key, Reyes began to pump the accelerator with his foot. Once, twice. The metallic squeak of the pedal was the only sound. On the third pump, he turned the key. Again holding it this time. For a heart-stopping second there was that same choked cough, but then it was followed by another, and another, a ragged, uneven rhythm that fought against the silence. It was the sound of a heart starting to beat again, struggling but determined. The whole Jeep shuddered, vibrating with the effort. The men who had turned away in disappointment now snapped their heads back, their eyes wide. Miller's jaw was clenched so tight I thought he might crack a tooth. It wasn't dead anymore. It was fighting to live, and we were all fighting with it, our wills collectively focused on that struggling engine. And then it happened. The sputtering caught, the ragged cough smoothed into a steady rhythm, and the engine exploded into a deafening, beautiful, life-affirming roar. The sound was the most incredible thing I had ever heard. It echoed off the canyon walls, a defiant shout of existence that drowned out the wind and our own fears. It wasn't just an engine. There was a promise. It was the sound of a door opening where there had only been a wall. Sergeant Reyes let out a breath he seemed to have been holding all day, a raw, shaky sound of pure relief. He looked over at Leo, and the expression on his face was one of absolute, unadulterated awe. He wasn't looking at a child anymore. He was looking at the man who had just saved his entire patrol. Miller just stood there, completely stunned, staring at the vibrating hood of the Jeep as if it were an alien spacecraft. The roar of the engine was our salvation, but it was also a dinner bell. It screamed our exact position to every sniper on the ridge. As if on cue, the response came. Not a single shot, but a volley. Bullets whizzed past us, kicking up dust and ricocheting off the rocks with angry metallic pings. The brief moment of awe was shattered. "Everybody in! Now!" Reyes roared, his voice cutting through the noise of the engine and the gunfire. He was a sergeant again, fully in command, the despair replaced by fierce urgency. The men didn't need to be told twice. They scrambled, throwing their packs into the back of the Jeep and piling in over the sides, a chaotic but efficient flood of bodies, desperate to get inside the moving shield we now possessed. The preparation was over. The climax, our mad dash through the kill zone, had just begun. I was the last one in, shoving a younger private ahead of me before hauling myself over the tailgate. The air was a storm of noise, the glorious, thundering roar of the engine mixed with the venomous crack of incoming rounds. Bullets hammered against the Jeep's steel body like angry fists, one of them screaming past my ear so close I felt the heat of its passage. There was no order to it, just a desperate, tangled mass of limbs and gear as we threw ourselves into the back. Men were cursing, praying, and shouting all at once. In that chaos, the Jeep wasn't just a vehicle anymore. It was a lifeboat in a sea of fire, and we were all clawing our way aboard. The smell of hot metal, cordite, and raw fear filled my lungs as I slammed down onto the hard metal floor. Sergeant Reyes wasn't panicking. He was transformed. All the earlier frustration and defeat had been burned away, replaced by a cold, hard focus. He gripped the steering wheel like he was trying to choke the life out of it, his knuckles white. He didn't look back to see if we were all in. He didn't need to. He slammed the gear stick into first with a brutal crunch of metal on. Metal, and the Jeep leapt forward with a force that threw us all against the back. The tires screamed on the rocky ground, fighting for purchase as he gunned the engine. We were moving. We were actually moving. Through the small rear opening, I saw the spot where we had been sitting ducks just moments before shrink rapidly, the ground around it pockmarked by fresh bullet impacts. We were driving straight into the heart of the kill zone. Amidst the chaos, I looked for Leo. I expected to see him, huddled on the floor, terrified like any child would be. But he wasn't. He was wedged between two large ammunition crates, his small hands gripping the edge of one to keep his balance. He wasn't crying or screaming. He was just watching. His eyes weren't fixed on the terrifying landscape flashing by or the soldiers around him. They were locked on the dashboard, on the oil pressure and temperature gauges, as if he was still monitoring his work, ensuring the engine he'd resurrected continued to perform under stress. In the middle of this symphony of panic and violence, he was a small island of profound, unnerving calm. It was as if he had built the engine, and now he was simply observing its test run, completely detached from the life-or-death stakes. Then my eyes met Corporal Miller's. He was pressed against the side of the Jeep, his rifle in his hands, but he wasn't firing. He was staring, not at the enemy, but at Leo. The smug, cynical mask he always wore was gone, shattered. In its place was a look of raw, unvarnished astonishment, a confusion so deep it bordered on fear. It was the face of a man whose entire understanding of the world had just been turned upside down. He saw a bullet hole appear in the canvas roof just inches above his head and didn't even flinch. His gaze remained fixed on the small boy who was calmly watching the gauges. He looked at me, his mouth slightly open, as if to say something, but no words came out. He just shook his head slowly, not in denial, but in complete world-altering disbelief. The pass was a blur of brown rock and green scrub. Reyes drove like a madman, wrestling with the wheel as the Jeep bounced and skidded over the uneven terrain. He wasn't trying to be subtle, he was just trying to be fast. A bullet spiderwebbed across the windshield right in front of his face, but he just leaned to the side and kept his foot pressed to the floor. The sound of the engine was our war cry, a defiant roar against the sniper fire that chased us. I could hear the rounds thudding into the back of the Jeep, one of them tearing through a spare water can with a sharp hiss. Each impact was a reminder of how thin the line was between our escape and our demise, a line drawn by a child's pocketknife and a sergeant's last-ditch faith. We were a metal target, and our only defense was the sheer, impossible momentum Leo had given us. And then, just as suddenly as it began, it was over. The narrow canyon walls fell away, opening up into a wider, rolling valley. The Jeep shot out of the pass like a cork from a bottle. Reyes didn't slow down, pushing us another half-mile into the relative safety of the open terrain before the sound of gunfire finally faded behind us, swallowed by the roar of our own engine. He finally eased his foot off the accelerator, and the Jeep coasted to a stop in a cloud of dust. The sudden silence was jarring. All we could hear was the steady, rhythmic ticking of the cooling engine and the sound of our own ragged breathing. For a long moment no one moved. We just sat there, covered in dust and sweat, the adrenaline slowly draining away, leaving a profound sense of exhaustion and disbelief in its wake. We were alive. We were out. Sergeant Reyes killed the engine. The silence that followed was absolute. He sat perfectly still for a second, his hands still gripping the wheel. Then, very slowly, he turned in his seat. He didn't look at me or at Miller, or any of the other seasoned soldiers who were staring back at him. He looked past all of us, his gaze landing on the small, grease-stained boy still sitting quietly by the ammo crates. He didn't smile. He didn't speak. He just looked at Leo, and in that look was everything. It was respect. It was gratitude. It was an apology. It was the silent admission from a hardened warrior that his rank, his experience, and his strength had all failed, and that a child had succeeded. In that moment, the hierarchy of the patrol was redrawn. Leo wasn't an orphan that we were protecting anymore. He was one of us. He was the one who had saved us all. Corporal Miller was the first to move after the sergeant. He slid stiffly out of the back of the Jeep, his face pale under the grime. He walked around to where Leo was now standing on the ground, his small frame looking even smaller next to the hulking vehicle. Miller didn't say a word. He reached into his pocket and pulled out Leo's pocketknife. He had picked it up from the floor of the Jeep during the chaotic escape. But it wasn't just handed back. I watched as he took a clean rag from his own pack and meticulously wiped the grease and dirt from the worn wooden handle and the blade. He held it for a moment, then offered it to Leo, handle first. It was a soldier's gesture of respect, an apology more profound than any words he could have spoken. Leo took it, his expression unreadable, and simply slipped it back into his pocket. The debt was paid. The ride back to the forward operating base was different. The usual roughhousing and cynical banter was gone, replaced by a quiet, contemplative mood. Leo wasn't relegated to a corner anymore. One of the younger privates gave up his seat near the front, insisting the boy take it. No one called him kid or orphan. They just called him Leo. During a brief stop to check our bearings, I saw Sergeant Reyes share his own canteen with Leo, a simple act, but one that spoke volumes about the new order of things. He was no longer a passenger or a piece of baggage we were hauling around. He was a member of the patrol, a quiet, essential part of the machinery that kept us all alive. He had earned his place not through pity, but through a competence that had shamed us all. When we got back, Sergeant Reyes had to file an after-action report. I saw him later, sitting at a makeshift desk, staring at the blank form. How do you explain a miracle to a bureaucracy? He couldn't write that an 11-year-old had fixed a critical piece of military hardware with a pocketknife when trained men had failed. I heard later that he'd written something about unconventional field repairs and a fortuitous discovery of a previously unseen electrical short, but he also made a formal request. He didn't ask for a medal for the boy. He requested that Leo be officially assigned to the base's motor pool as an apprentice, citing his unusual mechanical aptitude. It was a brilliant move, giving Leo a future and a purpose, protecting him within the system that would never truly understand his gift. From that day on, Leo was no longer our responsibility. He was the motor pool's prize. The grizzled old mechanics, men who spoke more in grunts and curses than in words, took him in. They heard the story from Reyes, and their initial disbelief turned into a gruff, protective respect. They gave him his own small toolbox, filled with old, mismatched tools. He spent his days there, covered in grease, his small hands learning the secrets of diesel, engines and transmissions. He rarely spoke, but he didn't need to. He was in his element, surrounded by the familiar language of broken things being made whole again. He had lost one family to the war, but in the smoky, oil-scented chaos of that garage, he had found another. He wasn't an orphan anymore, he was a mechanic. We all changed after that day in the pass. For me, it was a hard lesson in humility. I learned that courage and knowledge come in the most unexpected forms, and that the person you dismiss most easily might be the one you need the most. For Corporal Miller, it was a complete rewiring of his cynical worldview. He became quieter, more observant, and I never heard him belittle anyone ever again. And for Sergeant Reyes, it was a reminder that leadership isn't always about giving orders. Sometimes it's about knowing when to step aside and trust the quietest voice in the room. We had driven into that canyon as a standard military patrol, defined by ranks and rules. We drove out as a group of men who knew that some things, the things that truly matter, can't be taught from a manual. That day, trapped between a rock and a firefight, we learned that true expertise doesn't come with a rank or a uniform, and that sometimes the solution to an impossible problem lies in the hands of a boy who could see a way forward where everyone else had only seen scrap. It was a lesson etched not in a report, but in the memory of a roaring engine and the quiet dignity of a child who knew his worth long before we did. It's a story I carry with me, a reminder that the most powerful engines aren't always made of steel. If you know someone who needs to hear this message of self-belief, please share this video with them. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories about finding your own path, even when it's not what others expect. Thank you for listening. We all changed after that day in the pass. For me, it was a hard lesson in humility. I learned that courage and knowledge come in the most unexpected forms, and that the person you dismiss most easily might be the one you need the most. For Corporal Miller, it was a complete rewiring of his cynical worldview. He became quieter, more observant, and I never heard him belittle anyone ever again. He'd just stare off into the distance sometimes, and I knew he was back in that canyon, watching a boy with a pocket knife dismantle his certainty. And for Sergeant Reyes, it was a reminder that leadership isn't always about giving orders. Sometimes it's about knowing when to step aside and trust the quietest voice in the room. We had driven into that canyon as a standard military patrol, defined by ranks and rules. We drove out as a group of men who knew that some things, the things that truly matter, can't be taught from a manual. The story of the Jeep became a quiet legend around the base, not a tale of heroism, but a cautionary one about arrogance. It wasn't about a miracle. It was about paying attention. It was about the failure of our own systems. The manuals, the training, the entire top-down structure of command, it all meant nothing when faced with a problem that required a different kind of sight. It taught me to look for the person who isn't talking, the one who is just watching and thinking. True value isn't loud. It doesn't wear a uniform or carry a title. Sometimes it's a quiet kid with grease under his fingernails who understands the world in a way the rest of us have forgotten. We were so busy, looking for a complex solution, that we couldn't see the simple truth right in front of us, held in the hands of a child. In the end, it was never really about the Jeep. That engine was just a symbol of our own broken hope. Leo didn't just fix a wire, he repaired something inside all of us that day. He reminded us that there is always a way forward, even when the experts have given up. His quiet confidence in the face of our loud panic was a lesson more profound than any firefight. The roar of that engine wasn't just the sound of our escape. It was the sound of a rigid, broken world, being forced to make room for something new, something it couldn't explain or categorize. It was the sound of potential being realized, a powerful testament to the idea that the most overlooked people often carry the keys to our survival, if we're only humble enough to ask for their help. That day, trapped between a rock and a firefight, we learned that true expertise doesn't come with a rank or a uniform, and that sometimes the solution to an impossible problem lies in the hands of a boy who could see a way forward where everyone else had only seen scrap. It's a story I carry with me, a reminder that the most powerful engines aren't always made of steel. We all face our own versions of that dead Jeep, our own moments of feeling invisible when we know we have the answer. The challenge is not just in knowing the solution, but in having the courage to speak up, to point to the problem, even when the sergeants and corporals of our own lives are telling us to get out of the way and let the experts handle it. If you know someone who needs to hear this message of self-belief, please share this video with them. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories about finding your own path even when it's not what others expect. Thank you for listening.